If every human alive today ultimately traces their ancestry back to Africa, does that mean the first humans were black? The answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, and the ancestors of modern humans living under intense African sunlight likely had dark, melanin-rich skin. But there is a catch. Those people would not have called themselves black. They weren't African American. They weren't Nigerian or Jamaican. In fact, the racial categories we use today wouldn't exist for hundreds of thousands of years. So dark skin is ancient, but black people, as a modern racial category, are much newer. And that raises an obvious question. If dark skin is so ancient, why isn't everyone dark-skinned today? Maybe we've been asking that question backwards. Instead of asking why black people have dark skin, ask why some human populations became lighter. Melanin helps protect the body from ultraviolet radiation. Near the equator, where UV exposure is intense, darker pigmentation offered important protection. But humans didn't stay in Africa. As populations migrated into regions with much weaker UV radiation, the evolutionary pressures changed. Over thousands of generations, lighter pigmentation evolved in some populations, influenced in part by the biological trade-offs surrounding UV protection and vitamin D production. In other words, human skin color isn't a ranking system. It's geography written into biology. And here's the part people often get backwards. Dark skin isn't some unusual modification of a naturally white human being. Deep pigmentation is ancestral. So nature produced variation in human pigmentation. But nature didn't write black and white on people. Humans did that later. And for most of human history, someone living in Africa would not necessarily have thought of himself primarily as black. He might have identified by his family, language, community, ethnicity, kingdom, or religion. Because Africa was never one people. It is enormous, containing thousands of communities and an extraordinary range of cultures. The broad racial category black became especially significant much later, as Africans and Europeans came into increasingly intense contact and Atlantic societies began sorting people into racial groups. And that's where something strange happens to the way history is usually told. Search for black history, and the story often seems to begin with chains. But that's like starting a movie halfway through, because black history did not begin with slavery. Long before the transatlantic slave trade reached its height, African societies were building kingdoms, cities, trade networks, and centers of learning. The Mali Empire became one of the great powers of West Africa. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, became legendary for the enormous wealth displayed during his pilgrimage to Mecca. Timbuktu developed into an important center of commerce and Islamic scholarship, where manuscripts on religion, law, mathematics, astronomy, and other subjects were copied and studied. Farther east, Axum had been a major trading power connecting Africa with Arabia and the wider world. Farther south, the builders of Great Zimbabwe constructed enormous stone structures whose walls still stand today. And these are only fragments of a continent's history. Africa was not one civilization. It contained many. Kingdoms rose and fell, merchants crossed deserts. Ships crossed the Indian Ocean, scholars studied, armies fought, rulers competed. So African history is much older, richer, and more complicated than the chapter called slavery. But then, global trade created one of the darkest turns in that history. European colonies in the Americas demanded enormous quantities of labor, especially for plantations producing commodities like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. And human beings became cargo. Over the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, roughly 12.5 million captive Africans were put aboard slave ships. About 10.7 million survived the Atlantic crossing. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. Who actually sold them? The answer is more complicated than the simple image of Europeans arriving on African beaches and personally kidnapping millions of people. Captives entered the trade through wars, raids, kidnapping, punishment, debt, and political conflict. Some African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries captured or sold other Africans. European traders purchased captives along the coast and transported them across the Atlantic, while European colonial economies created enormous demand for enslaved labor and built a vast commercial system around it. There was no single African side because there was no single Africa. People who would later all be classified as black could belong to rival societies, separated by language, politics, and identity. But once aboard the ships, those distinctions often mattered little to the system carrying them away. Their names could be changed, families were separated, freedom was taken, yet something remarkable survived the crossing. Memory, rhythm, food, belief, language, family traditions, and resistance. Millions of people were forced away from Africa, but pieces of Africa crossed the ocean with them. And that leads to another strange fact. Slavery itself wasn't new. The Romans had slaves. Many African societies had forms of slavery. So did societies in the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. Human beings had enslaved other human beings for thousands of years. So why did slavery in the Americas become so closely connected to black skin? Because Atlantic slavery developed into something particularly rigid. Over time, colonial laws increasingly connected enslavement with African ancestry. Slavery became racialized, and in many colonies it became hereditary. A child could enter the world already legally enslaved because of the status of his or her mother. Race became more than appearance. It became part of the machinery that helped determine who could be enslaved, who could claim rights, and where someone stood in society. Racial ideology didn't merely describe this system, it helped justify it. But there was one problem. Enslaved people kept resisting. Some escaped. Some sabotaged work, some preserved forbidden traditions, some created independent maroon communities, some rebelled. And in Saint-Domingue, enslaved people participated in a revolution that destroyed the colony's slave regime and eventually created independent Haiti. A system designed to make bondage permanent discovered that permanence was impossible. Across the Atlantic world, abolition movements, resistance, revolutions, war, and political change gradually destroyed legal slavery. In the United States, slavery formally ended in 1865. But ending slavery turned out to be much easier than ending the hierarchy built around it. Imagine being told you're free, and then discovering freedom doesn't mean equality. After the American Civil War came Reconstruction. Black Americans voted, held political office, built institutions, and for a brief period, possibilities opened that had been unimaginable under slavery. Then came the backlash. Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, racial terror. Laws and customs separated Americans by race and restricted black political and economic power. Slavery was gone as a legal institution. Racial inequality wasn't. But something important was happening at the same time. Black Americans were building schools, churches, businesses, newspapers, colleges, civic organizations. Communities that had been denied freedom for generations were now creating institutions of their own. They weren't simply waiting for America to give them a future. They were building one. And eventually, those institutions helped support a movement the country could no longer ignore. Think about the problem for a moment. How does a population that has been denied political power force one of the most powerful countries on earth to change its laws? Not through one person, and not through one speech. Rosa Parks didn't simply refuse to surrender her seat because she happened to be tired one afternoon. She was already connected to civil rights activism. Martin Luther King Jr. did not create the movement by himself. Behind the famous names were organizers, churches, students, lawyers, activists, and ordinary families. They organized boycotts, sat at segregated lunch counters, rode buses into hostile territory, filed lawsuits, marched, registered voters, went to jail, and sometimes risked their lives simply to demand rights the country already claimed to believe in. The pressure helped produce landmark changes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the deeper achievement wasn't just changing legislation. People who had been excluded from full participation in American democracy forced America to confront the gap between what its ideals promised and what millions of its citizens actually experienced. They didn't just demand a place inside American democracy. They helped change what American democracy had to become. But politics wasn't the only thing black communities changed. Because now comes one of the strangest reversals in this entire story. A population repeatedly pushed toward the margins of American society would become extraordinarily influential at the center of global popular culture. You can hear it. Blues emerged from black American experience and musical traditions. Then jazz transformed music. Black musicians were central to the development of rock and roll. Gospel, soul, funk, and R&B reshaped popular sound again. And then in neighborhoods of New York City, hip-hop emerged from black and Latino communities and eventually became a global cultural force. Think about that trajectory. Music born from communities with limited political and economic power eventually filled clubs, stadiums, headphones, films, advertisements, and radio stations around the planet. And it didn't stop at music. Dance, fashion, language, comedy, film, sports, popular culture. Some of America's most influential cultural exports carry unmistakable black American fingerprints. And perhaps that's one of the greatest ironies of the entire story. People repeatedly pushed toward the cultural margins, helped reshape the cultural center. But now we have a problem. We've spent almost 9 minutes talking about black people. So who exactly are black people? Is a Nigerian black? Usually yes. An African American? Yes. A Jamaican? Often yes. An Afro-Brazilian? Yes. A black British person? Yes. An Ethiopian? Often, depending on context. But put those people in one room and something becomes obvious. They aren't one people. They may speak completely different languages, eat different foods, practice different religions, have different national histories, belong to different ethnic groups, and even understand race differently depending on the societies in which they grew up. Black can be a powerful shared identity. But it isn't one ethnicity, one nationality, one culture, or one story. Which brings us all the way back to the question we started with. Were the first humans black? They were African. Early Homo sapiens populations likely had dark pigmentation. But asking whether they were black applies a modern racial category to people who lived hundreds of thousands of years before that category existed. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand. Black history doesn't begin with slavery. It stretches far deeper into the human story. Black identity isn't defined by skin alone. And despite everything you've just heard, there has never been only one black story.